The deed she never checked. The funeral home called while I was still on hold with the title company. 2 phones, 2 conversations, 1 week. That was the math of my life that February. I had spent 3 days choosing a casket, writing an obituary, and calling relatives who hadn't spoken to my mother in a decade, but suddenly had opinions about the flower arrangements. I had spent those same 3 days fielding a different kind of call entirely, from a title company representative named Diane, who kept apologizing for bothering me during such a difficult time, and who kept asking the same question in slightly different ways. I just need to confirm, you're listed as the sole owner on this property. Is your sister aware of that? She wasn't. That was about to become a very expensive piece of information for my sister to learn. Before I tell you what happened when Rachel found out she'd sold a house she didn't own, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I want to know how far this one travels. My name is Claire. I'm 36 years old. To my family, I was the responsible one. Not in the warm, appreciated sense of the word, in the useful sense. The one who handled things. The one you called when something needed managing, and the one who got quietly written out of the credit once it was handled. To my mother, in the last 2 years of her life, I was the daughter who showed up. The one who drove 90 minutes each way for chemo appointments, who learned to manage 7 different medications on 7 different schedules, who slept in a recliner beside her hospital bed more nights than I can count. To the county recorder's office, I was something my sister did not know to check, the sole legal owner of our mother's house. I want to tell you exactly how that happened, and exactly what my sister did before she found out. My mother bought that house in 1987. A small brick rambler on a quiet street, the only home I'd ever really known as a child before my parents divorced, and my father moved 3 states away and slowly became a man we exchanged holiday cards with. My sister Rachel was 4 years older than me and had left that house, emotionally if not always physically, the moment she turned 18. She moved to the city, built a career in marketing, married a man named Todd who sold commercial real estate and talked about square footage the way other people talk about the weather. She visited our mother on holidays. She called on birthdays. She loved her, I believe that. He just loved her from a comfortable distance, the kind of distance that lets you keep your own life fully intact. I did not have that distance. I lived 20 minutes away. I had built my career. I run a small but profitable property management consultancy around the kind of flexible schedule that let me be available. And my mother's hip replacement went wrong in 2021 and recovery turned into 11 weeks of complications. I was the one who took family leave. When the diagnosis came 18 months later, pancreatic cancer, stage 3, the kind of news that rearranges your entire sense of time, I was the one who sat in the oncologist's office taking notes. My mother was a practical woman. She had worked as a paralegal for 30 years before retiring, and she understood paperwork the way some people understand music, instinctively, fluently, without needing to think too hard about the mechanics. 8 months before she died, she sat me down at her kitchen table with a folder of documents she had clearly been preparing for some time. "I want to do this properly," she said, "while I can still make the decision myself." She had drafted a transfer on death deed, a legal instrument that names a beneficiary who automatically receives the property the moment the owner dies, bypassing probate entirely. She had used the same paralegal contacts she'd worked with for decades. The document was clean, notarized, and recorded with the county exactly as required by law. She named me as the sole beneficiary. "Rachel will understand," she said, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely sure of that herself. "You're the one who's here. You're the one who will need it. I've already talked to her about the rest of things, the savings account, her jewelry, that's split evenly. The house is yours. I want you to have somewhere that's actually yours." I asked her if she wanted to tell Rachel directly. She said she would, eventually. When the time felt right. The time never felt right. 8 months later, she was gone, and the conversation she'd been planning to have had quietly died with her. The funeral was on a Tuesday. Rachel flew in 2 days before, efficient as always, and immediately began doing what Rachel did best, managing the optics of grief. She chose the flowers. She wrote a eulogy that made our mother sound like a woman neither of us had quite grown up with. She thanked me in front of the assembled relatives for holding things together, in a tone that made it sound like a hobby rather than 2 years of my actual life. I let it go. I was tired in a way that didn't leave room for keeping score. What I did not know, what I would only learn later, piecing it together from Diane's increasingly careful phone calls, was that Rachel had already, before the funeral, contacted a realtor. She had grown up in that house. She had assumed the way people assume things about property they've never bothered to verify, that she and I would inherit it jointly, the way our mother's will, an older document, drafted years before the transfer on death deed, technically stated. The will split the estate evenly. The will did not account for the deed, because the deed had been recorded separately and superseded it entirely for that specific asset. Our mother's paralegal instincts again, clean, deliberate, legally airtight. Rachel hadn't read the will closely. She certainly hadn't checked the county property records, because why would you check records on a house your mother had owned outright for 37 years? You'd assume you knew what you were inheriting. She listed the house 6 days after the funeral. She had a buyer in escrow within 2 weeks, a young couple relocating for job, pre-approved, motivated, the kind of buyer every realtor dreams of. The sale moved fast. Rachel signed the listing agreement, the disclosures, the purchase contract. She had, in her mind, simply executed her half of an inheritance that needed handling, the same way she'd handled the flowers and the eulogy, efficiently, from a comfortable distance, without involving me in details she assumed were already settled. The title company assigned to close the sale was Meridian Title. And Meridian Title, doing exactly what title companies are legally required to do, ran a full chain of title search before closing. That's when Diane found the transfer on death deed. That's when Diane found my name. I was sitting in the funeral home's small consultation room, looking at a binder of casket fabric swatches, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Diane introduced herself carefully, the way people do when they suspect they are about to deliver complicated news to someone already in crisis. She explained that she was handling the closing for property. She gave the address, my mother's address, and that during the title search, she'd found a recorded transfer on death deed naming me as sole beneficiary. I wanted to reach out directly, she said, because the seller listed on the purchase agreement is a Rachel Whitfield, and based on what I'm seeing in the county records, she may not have legal authority to convey this property. I need to ask, are you aware of this transaction? I was not. I sat very still in that small room with the casket swatches in front of me, and I asked Diane to walk me through exactly what she'd found. The deed. Recorded 8 months prior. Notarized. Filed with the county. My name, sole beneficiary, effective immediately upon my mother's death, which had been confirmed 2 weeks earlier, the death certificate already on file. Rachel had listed and contracted to sell a house that, legally, had become mine the moment our mother died. I asked Diane what would happen if the closing proceeded without this being resolved. She told me carefully that it wouldn't. Title companies don't insure clouded title. The sale could not close until the ownership discrepancy was resolved, meaning either I signed off on the transfer, or the deal collapsed and Rachel would be in breach of contract with a buyer who had already given notice on their current lease, already scheduled movers, already begun the particular logistical avalanche of relocating a family. I told Diane I needed a day to think. I did not call Rachel that day. I did not call her the next day either. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't strategy, not at first. I was exhausted, in a way that made even necessary confrontations feel like more than I could carry. I had just buried our mother. I needed 48 hours, where I wasn't managing anyone's crisis but my own grief. But by the third day, something had shifted from exhaustion into clarity. I thought about the eulogy. Holding things together. I thought about the 11 weeks after the hip surgery, the 18 months of appointments, the recliner, the 7 medications on 7 schedules. I thought about the comfortable distance Rachel had maintained for 15 years, the distance that let her show up efficiently for 3 days and write a eulogy and assume, without checking, that whatever remained would simply be hers to manage too. I called my own attorney, a man named Walter who had handled my business contracts for years and who, it turned out, also had deep experience in estate matters. I told him everything. He pulled the recorded deed himself within the hour and confirmed everything Diane had told me. "You have no obligation to facilitate this sale," he said. "Legally, your sister has no standing to convey this property. The buyer's recourse, if any, is against her, not against you. You could let this collapse entirely, and you would be completely within your rights." I asked him what he would do. He said that wasn't his decision to make. But he did say one thing that stayed with me. "Your mother went out of her way to make this clean. She didn't leave you an argument. She left you a deed. I let the deed do the talking." I called Rachel on a Thursday evening. I kept my voice even, the way I'd learned to keep it even during 2 years of difficult medical conversations. I told her I'd received a call from Meridian Title. There was a pause on the line, the specific pause of someone recalibrating in real time. "Okay," she said slowly. "I was going to loop you in once we had a closing date. I didn't want to bother you with logistics right after the funeral." "Rachel," I said, "the house isn't in the estate. It was transferred to me directly, 8 months before Mom died. There's a recorded deed." The pause this time was longer. "That's not," she started. "The will says the estate is split 50-50. The will covers what was in the estate at the time of her death," I said. The house wasn't. Mom moved it into a transfer on death deed, naming me as beneficiary. It's recorded with the county. It's been recorded for 8 months. You're telling me you've owned this house, that you've known you owned this house, and you let me list it. Let me put it in escrow. Let me sign a contract with actual people who are actually moving. I want to be honest here, because this is the part of the story where I understand how it looks. I didn't know you'd listed it, I said. I found out the same way you're finding out right now you don't own it, from the title company doing their job. I've had this information for 3 days. You've apparently had a buyer in escrow for 2 weeks. Why didn't Mom tell me? I don't know, I said, and this part was true. I asked her to. She said she would, when the time felt right. I think the time never felt right, because she knew exactly how this conversation would go. Rachel's voice changed registers then, the bright, efficient Rachel giving way to something rower. So what, you're just going to let my buyers walk away? Let me eat the breach of contract. You're going to do this to me 3 weeks after we buried our mother. I sat with that for a moment. I want to tell you I felt nothing, that I was entirely calm, that I'd transcended the hurt of it. That wouldn't be honest. I felt the old, familiar ache of being the one who manages the fallout, while someone else gets to feel the feelings publicly. But underneath, that ache was something steadier, something that had been building for 2 years of recliners and medication schedules, and a eulogy that thanked me like I'd organized a nice dinner party. I'm not doing anything to you, I said. I didn't list a house I didn't own. I didn't sign a contract I had no authority to sign. You did that. I'm simply not signing off on a sale of property that's legally mine, to facilitate a transaction I had no part in creating. So what do you want? I want you to call your buyers and explain that the closing can't proceed as structured. I want you to understand that this house was never part of the estate, and it was never yours to sell. And I want you to think, really think, about why Mom made sure of that 8 months before she died, after 37 years of owning this house outright. The sale collapsed 2 days later. Rachel's buyers, understandably furious, walked away and pursued, successfully, I later learned, a breach of contract claim against her personally, since she'd signed representations about clear title that turned out to be false. That wasn't my doing. That was the natural consequence of listing something you never bothered to confirm you owned. I didn't gloat. I didn't tell anyone outside my own small circle what had happened. I didn't post about it, didn't frame it as a victory at family gatherings I no longer particularly wanted to attend. What I did was sit with the house for a few months before deciding what to do with it. I walked through it alone on a Sunday afternoon, room by room, the kitchen where my mother had taught me to make her mother's bread, the back bedroom where I'd slept during every visit for 2 years, the small office where she'd kept that folder of documents she'd been so deliberate about. I found, in that office, the original transfer on death paperwork along with a handwritten note I hadn't known existed. It wasn't legally binding, just a few lines in her familiar handwriting tucked into the folder. Claire, I know this might cause friction with your sister. I've thought about it for a long time, and I keep arriving at the same answer. You stayed. You're the one who should have something certain. I'm sorry I didn't have the courage to explain this to Rachel myself. That was a failure of mine, not yours. Please don't let it become a wound between you, if you can help it. Mom, I sat in that small office for a long time after reading it. Rachel and I haven't fully repaired things. We talk occasionally, carefully, the way people do after something has cracked but not entirely broken. I don't know if we'll get back to easy. I'm not sure we ever had easy, not really, just a long-standing arrangement where I managed things and she appreciated them from a comfortable distance. I kept the house. I didn't sell it. I rent it out now to a young family, the kind my mother would have liked, and I used the income to fund a small scholarship in her name at the community college where she once took night classes to become a paralegal. I think about Diane's careful phone call sometimes, the way she kept apologizing for the timing while I sat with casket fabric swatches in front of me. I think about how close everything came to closing, how if Meridian title had been less thorough, if my mother had been less deliberate, the house might simply have been gone, sold out from under a legal claim I didn't even know I needed to assert. My mother spent 30 years as a paralegal, making sure other people's paperwork was airtight. In the end, the last and most important document she ever filed was the one that made sure I couldn't be quietly written out of the one thing she had left to give me.